Good morning, guys. Welcome back to my kitchen. I have a few different preserving projects that I want to get done today. I'm planning on doing some water bath canning, some pressure canning, and then I think some fermenting as well. I have some pickling cucumbers that I need to get used up, and I'm planning to use those to make some bread and butter pickles. So I'm just cleaning those up right now. And then I want to do a couple rounds in the pressure canner. I'm planning on doing some beans today, as well as some carrots. They're probably going to be relatively small batches, but we have too many for fresh eating right now, so I want to get some of those into the pantry. And then I also have kind of an awkward amount of jalapeños right now, too many for us to use just for fresh eating before they start to go bad, and not really enough to make it worthwhile to pickle the jalapeños and then can them. So I think I'm just going to do a batch of fermented jalapeños for those. So that's what I'm thinking I'm going to get done today. I'm going to get these cucumbers all washed up, and I want to get to the bread and butter pickles first because they're going to have to sit in the fridge for a few hours. So I'll start out on those and then move on to some of the pressure canning, and then I can come back to those a little bit later when they're ready for the canning process. So the recipe that I'm using for the bread and butter pickles is adapted from the Ball Complete Book of Home Preserving. I'm just adjusting some of the seasonings a little bit. And for that, I'm going to need 4 pounds of pickling cucumbers, and I'm just slicing them to about 1/4 inch thick. I'm also going to need 4 yellow onions. I'm going to thinly slice those, and then 5 cloves of garlic. And I am just going to add all of this to a bowl, and then I'm going to place a tea towel over top and add in some ice, and then that's just going to sit in the fridge for at least a few hours. I'm just going to let it sit in there while I get to some of my other projects today, and then that's going to help to keep them really crisp after canning. Alright, I've got all of the cucumbers, onions, and garlic chopped up in here. I'm just going to transfer this to a bigger bowl to make it a little bit easier to mix together. And then I'm adding in 1/3 cup of salt, and then I'm going to cover this with a tea towel, fill it up with ice, and then it's just going to sit in the fridge for a few hours. So this is a slightly different method than what the Ball recipe calls for. It just says to, after you've mixed all the salt, cucumbers, onions, and garlic together, to cover it with cold water for a couple hours and let it sit at room temperature. But this is how I originally did it, and it worked really well to keep them crispy, so I've just continued to do it that way. Alright, I have the cucumbers for the bread and butter pickles in the fridge, and I'm going to leave those in there for probably at least 4 hours. You could leave them in there overnight, but I want to get this all done today. And I've gone ahead and washed up all my beans, and I am just getting these snapped, and they're going to be ready to get into some jars. Canning beans is one of the easiest things to do, and I find one of our most used things in the pantry, so I'm trying to do a lot more this year. It's nice because as far as pressure canning goes, beans are a pretty quick project. The processing time is only 20 minutes for pints or 25 minutes for quarts. Okay, I have my beans all washed, prepped, ready to go, and I'm canning these in wide mouth pint jars. Pint jars are just the size that makes the most sense for us. And I am going to pack these in relatively tight to 1 inch of headspace. I'm going to be adding a 1/2 teaspoon of salt. You don't have to. That is just my preference. And then I'm going to top these off with hot water. So these jars are warm. You can hot pack beans. My preference, though, just for ease and texture, is to raw pack them. So it ends up being about 3/4 to 1 pound of beans per pint. I have 9 pints that I'm doing today. And I'm going to add a 1/2 teaspoon of salt per jar. If you're doing quarts, you would want to do 1 teaspoon of salt if you're going to include it. And then I'm going to top these off with just some hot water. I'm just using a chopstick to debubble, then I'll adjust the headspace and clean up the rims. Now, since this is just the beans, water, and salt, I'm just going to use a dishcloth with some hot water on it to wipe them off. Get some lids on, rings on, fingertip tight, and these are going to be ready for the canner. Now I'm just adding 3 quarts of water to my Presto pressure canner. That's how much it needs, and I did try to match the temperature to the temperature of the jars. Okay, so I've got all the beans in my pressure canner and I've got the element on, so as soon as I see a steady stream of steam coming out of the vent pipe, I'm going to allow that to vent for 10 minutes before I add the regulator. And since I'm doing pints, I'm going to process these for 20 minutes. For quarts, it would just be 25, and I'm processing at 11 pounds of pressure since I'm using a dial gauge pressure canner, and that's taking into consideration my elevation. So while the beans are going in the canner, I am just getting the carrots all prepped. So I've gone ahead and washed these, and I am just getting these all peeled. I've got a bucket going here for the pigs. They get a lot of treats on days like this. And then I'll get these all chopped up and they'll be ready to go so that as soon as the beans are done in the canner, I can just swap these out and get those going. Okay, the beans are out of the canner. I'm running a little bit behind. I had to take a little bit of an intermission and run into town. So I'm just getting all of these carrots chopped up, and then these are going to be ready to get into some jars. I'm going to be raw packing these as well, and I'm going to be canning them in pints. That's just the size that works best for us. And this is not how I'm going to preserve the majority of our carrots this year. I'm planning to store most of them just in the fridge. I got some good tips from you guys on how to best do that. Canned carrots are not my favorite. They're definitely convenient to have on hand, and I like to have some, but I'm not going to do the bulk of our carrots this way. So I'm just adding the carrots to my pint jars to 1 inch of headspace. I am going to add a ½ teaspoon of salt to each jar, just like I did for the beans. If you were doing a quart, you would do a teaspoon of salt if you wanted to add it. And then I'll top these off with some water. I'm doing a smaller batch of carrots today. That wasn't entirely intentional. That's just what I had aside for canning. Typically, if I'm going to pressure can, I really do try and fill up the canner completely, but that is not the case today, and that is just fine. We're still getting a few more jars onto the shelf. So I've emptied out my canner from the round with the green beans, and I'm adding 3 more quarts of water and then adding my pint jars of the carrots, and these are going to process for 25 minutes. So as far as jalapeños go, I have too many to keep fresh, but not really enough to make it worthwhile to can. So when that's the case, I like to ferment things. It's a great way to add in probiotics to our diet and a great way to preserve. Once these are done fermenting, these will easily last months to a year in the fridge. I'm just slicing the jalapeños and adding those to a jar. For the brine, the ratio I use for most veggies is 2.5 tablespoons of salt to a quart of water. Through gardening season, I often have a batch ready to go in the fridge of the brine just to make this really quick and easy. But if I don't, the easiest way to make brine, if you don't want to have to wait for it to cool, is just by dissolving that salt in a couple cups of hot water and then topping it off with cold water. You don't want to pour hot brine over the veggies when you're fermenting because you run the risk of it destroying any of the good bacteria that's on the veggies. And the salt is going to prevent the bad bacteria from proliferating, and it's going to allow the good bacteria to multiply. So once the brine is cool, I just top the jar off with it, make sure they're covered completely, and then I add my fermenting weight. I like the ones from Mason Tops. Then I loosely add a lid and set these aside. I'll taste them after a few days. Things tend to ferment faster in the heat, and once they're to our liking, they'll go into the fridge for storage, and the cold will almost halt the fermentation. So I do this for small batch pickles, peppers, carrots, all sorts of things. Alright, the carrots are done in the canner. It's coming down from pressure and cooled off a bit. So these are coming out, and then I'm going to move on to the last task of the day and finish up on the pickles. Okay, so I've gone ahead and rinsed off the cucumber and onion mixture for the bread and butter pickles, and they were sitting in that salt for close to 8 hours in the fridge. So I've gone ahead and rinsed that off to get all of the salt off, and that whole process is going to make sure that they're nice and crisp after canning. So I'm going to get started on the brine, then we're going to get this into some jars and process them, and that is it for the day. For the bread and butter pickles, I'm loosely following the ball canning recipe. I'll leave the original recipe as well as my adjustments to the recipe in the description box down below. So to a pot, I'm adding 3 cups of apple cider vinegar. You can do white vinegar, you do just want to make sure it's 5% acidity. And then 3 cups of cane sugar. And then for the seasonings, this is where I'm adjusting things quite a bit. I'm doing 2 tablespoons of mustard seed, 1.5 teaspoons of celery seed, 1.5 teaspoons of turmeric, and a teaspoon of chili flakes. And then I'm going to stir that together, bring it up to a boil, and once it comes to a boil, I'll add in the cucumber and onion mixture, bring it back up to a boil again, and then these are ready to get into some jars. Okay, I'm almost done for the day. I'm gonna get these pint jars filled to a 1/2 inch headspace with the cucumber and onion mixture, and then I'm gonna top it off with this brine to a 1/2 inch headspace as well. Debubble, get the rims all cleaned, and then the lid's on, and this is gonna be ready to go. Now, typically I like to do this in a wide mouth jar, but I'm running low on lids, so we're doing this in regular mouth today. I greatly overestimated how many jars of these bread and butter pickles I'd get. The recipe does say 5 pints, and that is indeed what I ended up getting. With all that sugar in the brine, I'm just wiping the rims down with some white vinegar to make sure that I get a good seal. Alright, I have the pickles going in the canner. Those are going to process for 10 minutes, and then I am done for the day. This kind of turned into a small batch canning day, but honestly, this is what it looks like for us a lot of the time. So I'm going to wrap up the video here. I'll be sure to bring you back when those pickles are coming out of the canner. Thank you guys for joining me today, and I will see you in the next video.